in the Milken Institute School of Public Health, and particularly I work in the Department of Prevention and Community Health, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share a little bit about my journey with you all today about working on NIH grants and specifically the NIH approach section. And as you can see in the title of my presentation, I'll be drawing from an ongoing project that is currently in its second year called the Innovative Tools to Expand HIV Self-Testing and Long-Acting Injectables Among Commercial Minibus Drivers in Nigeria, also known as the ITES LAI project. Let's see now, next. So before talking about the project, I thought it might be helpful to share a little bit about my experience working on NIH grants and what has changed since I first started working on a smaller grant to the current present, and the inspiration for the ITES LAI project. So I first learned about NIH grants really as a PhD student, but I did not have the opportunity to write my own NIH style kind of grant until after I finished my PhD at Penn State University, and then I went to University of North Carolina for a postdoctoral fellowship. And that was in the years 2013 to 2016. And in 2014, I was encouraged to write an institutional style grant that was funded by University of North Carolina Center for AIDS Research. And the reason that I think this is very important, at least in my journey, is that even though it was not being submitted to the NIH, the recommendation is for the grant to at least be written in a similar style of an NIH grant. It was much shorter, maybe 4 to 5 pages, but the approach section in that grant is what I drew from when I ended up writing my first NIH style grant, which is called K99R00 grant. It's called a Pathway to Independence grant that NIH provides funding for domestic researchers, so meaning researchers in the United States. And I know they have an international version, or they had it. I don't know if they still have the K43 version, which is similar to a K99, where you have to write a training kind of grant, but you have to have an approach section that conveys your research as much as you need to convey your need for training. So after writing this grant, I was very excited when it was funded the second time. The first time it was scored, but it was not funded. But the second time it was funded in 2016. And then eventually, as I was working on this project, which focused on HIV self-testing, I became, it was in 2018, I had at least maybe 2 or 3 more years left on the K99 grant R00 phase. And typically the recommendation is to wait maybe until the last year of the K or the R00 grant to submit an R1 or an R34. But there was an opportunity to submit an application for an R1 in 2019, focusing on the topic that I was working on, or the group I was working on, which is men, heterosexual men in Africa mostly. So I took my chance during this time in 2018 to start preparing an R1 as an assistant professor. So, and the reason I did that was because I did not want to wait until it was time to write an R1 and then start learning how to write an R1. And also the approach and the R1 grant is very different from a K99 R00. So I wanted to give myself some time to start learning the process of writing an R1 and R21 during those couple of years. And as you see here, they were not funded, but it gave me a chance to start the journey of learning how to write an R1 and an R21. And then after those two R grants were not funded, I was blessed to have to become married, to get married, and then um, we had a daughter who took all the time that I had. So I stopped writing grants for a couple of years and focused on my family life. And then eventually, when I became an associate professor, I had my daughter became older. She was going to daycare, and then eventually I started to revisit the idea of writing grants. And during the last couple of years, I've submitted five R1s and one R34 grant, and only two of those six grants were funded, thankfully. And the two that were funded are two R1s. So today, I'll focus on one of the R1s that was funded, and also to share that the R01 that was funded for the project in Nigeria is actually the R21 that I first submitted back in 2018. But then I submitted this for a project in Haiti to work with minibus drivers in Haiti, focusing on promoting HIV self-testing. But it didn't get funded, but the idea stayed with me. And when I came back to grant writing, I realized that there was a lot of evidence in Nigeria from the other projects that Dr. Joseph Talker and other team members were working on. And I proposed the idea to write this R1 with the team, and thankfully was funded. So it originally was an R21 that was not funded, eventually turned into an R1 for another country, but the same group of the same population. So briefly, since I'll be talking about HIV self-testing, I thought, maybe many all of you know about HIV self-testing, but briefly, HIV self-testing, if you don't know, is an all blood-based test that individuals can use to test at home instead of going to the clinic. And the reason why this is important is because it helps to reduce a lot of the barriers that prevent people from going to test at the clinic, and reduces the stigma that they have to deal with, transportation costs, and so many other barriers. And it gives people the autonomy to test at home and learn their HIV status, whether negative or positive, initially at their house. But after the test at home, they still need to get the follow-up services if the self-test result is positive. So they have to find a nurse or find a clinic somewhere where they need to do the confirmatory testing so that they can start HIV treatment. And this is very important because if they don't get treatment, as many of you may know, they will not be able to benefit from the life-saving treatment that exists. And then if they are HIV negative but need to um, access PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, to help prevent them from getting HIV, then they also need to go to the clinic. So there's still a gap that the field is working, the HIV researchers who are working on HIV self-testing are interested in addressing, which is how to encourage people to get linked to care for HIV or treatment or PrEP. And in the past couple of years, HIV treatment as well as HIV prevention, pre-exposure prophylaxis are now have been available in not just oral pills, but also as an injection. So in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and also in the US, individuals can choose to receive their HIV treatment as once a month injection or once a couple of months. And then more recently, there's a new prevention injection that you can take once every 6 months. So these innovations and biomedical innovations have made it much more easier for people to receive their treatment and also prevention pills or injections, but also provides an opportunity for researchers who are interested in this topic to learn about what strategies will be most feasible, acceptable, and effective in encouraging people to go for long-acting injectables, whether it's for treatment or prevention, since these are fairly new, and as part of NIH grant writing, you need to have an innovation section. So that is the core of the innovation for the study that I will focus on in the next few slides, and share more about the approach sections. So as you can see here, these are the specific aims for the project. We propose to determine the comparative effectiveness of the ITEST LAI intervention compared to standard of care on LAI PrEP uptake and HIV prevention among minibus drivers in Nigeria. And in addition, we plan to explore the impact of mediating and moderating factors on influencing primary and secondary outcomes. And primary and secondary outcomes for AIM-1 is uptake of PrEP. Secondary outcomes include adherence on PrEP and eventually HIV prevention or HIV acquisition, so preventing people from acquiring HIV. And then for the second aim, it's the same intervention being compared to standard of care, but focusing on treatment. So individuals who receive an HIV self-testing kit will be following them to find out what happens after the test for HIV. If they are HIV negative, what part of the intervention helps them to go for the linkage to LAI PrEP. And then as part of our AIM-3, we are assessing the determinants of implementation and also assessing cost effectiveness of the intervention. So now that I've shared a little bit about the background and the aims, I'll jump into the approach section, and the importance of the approach section for this grant specifically, and also for any grant that you write. The first importance of the approach section, in my perspective, is that it helps to explain how you will accomplish what you propose in your specific aims. And the section reviewers usually scrutinize this very closely because this bulk of the grant is to convince the reviewers that not only do you have the proper skill set, but also the evidence, but that you can, you know what you need to do to successfully carry out the project. And also demonstrate the scientific rigor and feasibility, which I think Dr. Tucker was mentioning earlier, that if somebody reads your approach section, and it's written in a way where if someone were to take the same information and try to replicate it, it should be feasible in another setting. Maybe there'll be some tweaks needed if it's a different population, but it should be able to be replicated and based on the scientific rigor and feasibility. And it kind of conveys not only what you plan to do in terms of the intervention components, but the study design, the methods, and the kind of analysis that you plan to carry out to make sure that you have the right number of people who needs to be recruited in the study, and the type of analysis to detect whether there's a difference, at least in our one study. And this is also an opportunity where you need to share what potential challenges that may emerge during the project implementation. So for many projects and individuals who have experience with conducting these kind of research projects, they know challenges occur. And for example, currently there are a lot of challenges that are emerging because of the cuts in PEPFAR funding, which may not have been anticipated, but also was always part of the conversation, I think, for many people who work in HIV in the Global South, thinking about sustainability of many of these programs. So these are, some key points to think about the approach section, but the other key lessons I think that, I don't have written here is that writing an approach section or a grant is a teamwork. I've learned, as much as the science and the idea may be generated by one person, maybe, I'm interested in this topic, but to write the approach section very successfully, I've learned that it's very important to have a key team member or two key team members who are very invested in the topic, who have experience writing, approach sections and reviewing approach sections, so that They can give you feedback over time as you are working on it. And hopefully, you will give yourself, if you're very new at this, at least a good 6 months before you write the approach section. And then the other key factor I think I've learned recently is it's very important to have a copy editor or a person who is not so much an expert on the science, but an expert on how information needs to be presented. If we are scientists, we can be very passionate about the science, and in our head, it makes sense that okay, we are describing what we think needs to be described in a way that needs to be described, but then it's also a matter of how the science is being communicated, and how it's written, the flow of the grant proposal, so that the reviewers who are reviewing your grant can, don't feel like they have to struggle to find the information that they need. And I'm guilty of this because the first grant that I wrote that was not funded, I thought it was just about throwing a bunch of information in the proposal, in the approach section, just, however it is in there, it's fine. As long as it shows that I have a lot of information about a lot of things, then that will make it convincing. And I've learned over time that is not the case. You can have a lot of information, but you need to pay attention to how it's written, how it's and the way you present the information is just as important, if not more important, than the information that you actually are presenting. So I'll stop there and then go through this. So these are the different sections that I created with the team for the approach section of the iTest LAI project. And people write their approach sections, differently. I've read grants that are funded that do not follow this flow of information. And I like this approach because that's what I've kind of started using when I was writing my first couple of grants, and I just kept to this model where the first paragraph in the approach subsections for me is on the investigative team. And then in the 2 pages that follow, I provided several paragraphs for different studies that showed I had the experience with the team working on similar projects that would make us very competitive to carry out a similar project, but with a slight change by having the long-acting injectables. Then having a conceptual framework, a study setting, describing where the study would take place, and then as well as where the recruitment. So the place, of course, is Nigeria, but where are we recruiting, and so forth and so on. And then eventually providing a 1 paragraph summary of the study design. And then after that, going into the more step-by-step procedures of how we will carry out each aim of the project, and then eventually providing information about sample size. So I have here for sample size, power considerations, and dissemination plan and study timeline, a note that lets the reviewer know to look for this information in the other sections of the grant. And again, this is a preference. Other individuals I've spoken to say, no, I think it's important for you to put this in the approach section so that the reviewer doesn't have to go look for it. But I chose to do this because I wanted to leave the approach section to write as much as possible about what needed to be in the approach section, and then left the other sections for the other files, because there are other parts of the grant where you can, the reviewer will see the same information about the sample size, dissemination plan, and study timeline. So this is, again, a personal preference, but individuals I've spoken with usually, do not recommend this because, they think, what if the reviewer doesn't make it to those other sections? But yes, in this case, it worked out in our favor. So what I'll do now is just briefly show you a paragraph for the investigative team description. And of course, this was not the only information about the team. This was just the paragraph that introduced a high-level summary for the team. And then, as you can see here, the first sentence stated, details are provided in the biosketch and overall structure of study team document. So this is a very short version of the 2 to 3 pages document that we had about the study team. But the emphasis here is that, we mentioned that I and Dr. Uchoma Nwauzulu were both new and early investigators. And that's because if you're not familiar with the NIH new and early stage investigator status, is that within the first, after getting your PhD, I think you have maybe up to 10 years to be considered an early stage investigator. And if your grade is scored maybe not as high as a more established investigator, then they may consider funding it. So if you apply within the first 10 years, or if you're a new investigator, meaning it's the first time applying for an R1. So we kind of made that as clearly as possible to indicate, to the reviewers that, we are doing our best here as new and early stage investigators. But we also have experience working together with the original iTest project team, as well as we are supported by a strong group of co-investigators, very distinguished and very experienced researchers with different expertise that we do not have. And particularly for this project, one of the key expertise and prior experience that I wanted to emphasize was that we had experience working with, as you see here, we had experience working with community-based HIV prevention care research projects. We had experience working with HIV status neutral intervention, so meaning focusing not just on HIV treatment, but both HIV treatment and pre-exposure prophylaxis, as well as long-acting injectables. So I thankfully found a person to include on the team who had an ongoing project focusing on long-acting injectables in sub-Saharan Africa. So that provided the long-acting injectable expertise, because I did not have that expertise, and Dr. Uchoma did not have it, and actually no one else besides a couple of people on the team. So making sure I had people on the team that also had these other kind of experience, implementation science, as well as community engagement. So these are the key topics that are relevant for the proposal that I wanted to make sure I show that we have those experiences. And then after the paragraph on the team, then I spent a good 2 to 3 pages really, and that might be a bit excessive, but at the same time, and in this case, it worked out. The first page was really highlighting the effectiveness of the original iTest intervention, which stands for Innovative Tools to Expand HIV Self-Testing in Nigeria. So highlighting that we have conducted a prior trial that shows the preliminary effectiveness of this intervention. And then also adding a paragraph showing that we have implemented studies in multiple countries in sub-Saharan Africa that included community-based HIV testing and linkage to treatment, as well as preliminary data from Nigeria and other literature showing preferences for long-acting injectables. And then in the project, we also proposed to collect hair samples so that we could objectively measure adherence to PrEP and ART. And also, we found someone who had collected hair samples in Nigeria to measure exactly what we're proposing to do. So that showed very strong, experience and feasibility of the methods that we were proposing to use in this proposal, but also showed that we're not at the development stage. We're not, coming up with something totally new. This was something that had been piloted and even evaluated. What we were proposing was to really expand to another group and also adding, an innovative product for uptake. So after providing the preliminary studies section, then as we spent a good 1 page now describing the prior iTest intervention. So here, this paragraph is taken exactly from the grant, where I said, we wrote, based on our team's expertise, the high feasibility and effectiveness of the proposed intervention strategies, we incorporated LAI ART and LAI PrEP to create the iTest LAI intervention for commercial minibus drivers. So and then we talk about the original ITIS intervention had 4 implementation strategies. We have a figure in the proposal that showed what those implementation strategies are and how they will be continued for the future project, but then there will be some slight changes, specifically 2 changes, whereas the prior intervention was focused on adolescents and youth in general. We are focusing, on men who are minibus drivers. So we decided to have only male peer research facilitators, as well as the participant being referred to male-friendly clinics where LAIs are available. So after the description of the intervention, then we wrote where the study would take place and how we would go about recruiting the participants. So the first section of the study setting, we described the 4 local governmental areas that in Nigeria that we would be working in, 4 out of more. And the reason I provided for selecting 4 was that this was a newer, the prior project worked in more than 4 LGAs, but to make it not seem too over ambitious, even though it is an R1, I wanted to at least convey to the reviewers that we're not planning to do exactly the same by working in so many different LGAs. But again, Uchoma and I are both early stage investigators, so I wanted to at least show that as much as this is an innovative project, an exciting project, but we are also trying to pace ourselves and not overdo it too much. So we reduced the number of LGAs, and then we wrote that there would be selected clinics where the prior team had worked in for the prior project, and we would work in those same clinics, but then we would create male-friendly spaces for the participants in those 4 LGAs where we would work. And then we describe the sites where we would recruit the minibus drivers and who we would collaborate with to recruit the minibus drivers in their motor parks in Nigeria, in those 4 LGAs. And then after recruiting the stations and working with the National Union for Road and Transportation in Nigeria and the local entity of that same union, then we would be able to go into those stations and have the support of those unions to then engage the drivers. And I also looked at several other papers who had recruited minibus drivers for their project and see, kind of the process that they followed to also include that in this. So now after the study setting and recruitment procedures, then we provided a brief description of the study design. And this was very, all parts of the approach sections are very important, but the grant was due on a Monday, and on a Friday, I sent, the final version that I had on the Friday to one of the key team members to review. And after he reviewed it, not just a key team member, but somebody who had received and reviewed several NIH grants, and he responded on Friday that the study design that we had did not make any sense to him. He could not understand it, and it was not going to fare very well for us. And again, the grant is due on a Monday, and when he mentions this, and I, given that I know how important all these different sections are, I said, okay, we had a choice of keeping the design or to do major revisions during the weekend. And thankfully, we chose. I did the revisions over the weekend, and then I sent it to him again. I think like maybe Sunday night, and he said, "Okay, this made more sense." And the revisions really was to go from initially we were proposing a step wedge design cluster in the Mistral, which was similar to what the prior study had. But he said, and to me, that was my first time writing about a step wedge design. So it was confusing to me as I was writing it. So when he confirmed that, what I wrote was not making any sense to him, then I decided to just reduce the complexity of the design and made it more simple one meaning having an intervention arm and a control arm and keeping that throughout the study as opposed to the stepwatch design. So the design ended up again being just a randomized group randomized control trial with groups being randomized to either the intervention and or the control and staying in those groups throughout the study. We propose to recruit 400 minibus drivers and follow them to do follow-up surveys at 6, 12, 18, and 24 months. And it's a hybrid design where we are looking at both effectiveness as well as implementation barriers and facilitators. So this is just a visual of all the information that we have in the proposal describing step-by-step procedures for both aims 1 and 2. So the first is training the staff for the study. So we have just a brief paragraph describing how we will train the staff for the study, using the similar methods that was used in the prior study. So again, showing feasibility of this approach, and then eventually recruiting participants, from the motor park. So working with the different unions and leaders of those motor parks to recruit the participants after we do the training. And then once we start recruitment, enrolling and administering the baseline survey. So again, describing all of that information, and then eventually, after people are recruited are enrolled in the study, then describing how they will receive the HIV self-testing kit, how will they report the HIV self-test results, and then eventually what kind of support that they will receive in the intervention group that would encourage them to now go to the clinic, to the male-funded clinic, where they can receive LAI PrEP or LAI ART, and then eventually being followed, as I shared earlier, at the 6, 12, 18, and 24-month mark to assess their adherence, as well as whether they have acquired HIV if they're on PrEP, or if they have suppressed their viral load if they are on HIV treatment. And then for aim 3, which is more qualitative mixed method, where we have qualitative data collection to interview key individuals who have been enrolled in the study, like a subgroup of those men, as well as the nurses and healthcare providers. And then eventually we also have quantitative data collection that we will do to focus more on the clinic level factors that may affect the implementation of the intervention. And then we describe our data analysis plan for the mixed method, and eventually to use this information to share, disseminate with those in the decision-making spaces to potentially inform the scale up of this intervention strategy, or just providing to the evidence that can help to eventually support such scale up and uptake of long-acting injectables. I'll just take a few minutes to acknowledge the original iTest team for providing us, the support to write the iTest LAI project proposal, and also acknowledge the iTest LAI team, the National Institute of Health, and the group of minibus drivers in Haiti, where I am originally from, that serve as the inspiration for the first proposal for Haiti, and then of course the minibus drivers in Nigeria, where we are now implementing this project. That's all I have for the presentation. I'm happy to now stop and take any questions.
Bravo. Thanks, Donaldson. That was great. That was super. And I like how there were several questions that I answered about foreign grants and which grants are non-US citizens eligible for. I think your K99R00 is a really good example. It's a rare example of a K award that everyone is eligible for, as long as they're, the right sort of career stage. And I think I see a question in the Q&A. How long did it take for you to get your first grant? And I know you showed a timeline earlier, but maybe review the timeline a little bit more for that person. Yeah.
My first grant. So let me see. I think this is the timeline. Hold on.
And actually, even before your first NIH grant, what was before, like before the CFAR, was that your first grant as a postdoc?
As a postdoc, it was my first grant, but I also wanted to put my PhD dissertation grant experience here, but then I realized um, it was like a one-page proposal that they requested, and I think it's very different. As much as it does, of course, encourage you to think about how you carrying out your project, but it was very different. But I did have two dissertation research grants that I received as a PhD student that were $2,000 each, and but they were very different from the the CFAR grant. And then before the CFAR grant, I was supported to apply for a diversity supplement, and the diversity supplements, which no longer exists, was similar to a CFAR grant, or was more similar to a CFAR and a K-99 grant because the diversity supplement has a training component, it has a training focus. It's for early scientists who need to not just do a project, but need to explain what additional training skills. So the diversity supplement was not funded, but the information that we included in diversity supplements serve as a model for me to use in the CFAR as well as the K-99. So I guess the question, it took me maybe 2.5 years to receive my first grant from the NIH directly after finishing my PhD, and this was the K-99. But then after that, it took almost a decade to receive another grant from the NIH, or another couple of grants from the NIH. Because again, they are different from the K-99 grants, and they require a very different level of writing style and support that I think, of course, one can master much quicker than 10 years, because I think, I mentioned earlier, I took at least 3 to 5 years off from writing grants because I was focusing on my family. And then when I returned to writing grants, then it was the last couple of years before I did not qualify as an early stage investigator. So I just maximize by writing as many grants as I mentioned, by writing like 6 grants and see which one would get funded. But also, I think one additional experience I should share is that when I wrote the first R1 that was funded, the reason I decided to write the other R1s was because the reviewers for the second submission of this R1 gave me great feedback where, compared to the first time I submitted the R1 in 2019, the reviewers in 2019 just trashed the grant. They just said this did not make any sense, and it was very, it was poorly written, and it was not going to go anywhere. So that also discouraged me from even wanting to try again. But then when I returned to grant writing, I spent more time reading successful grants. So after reading grants that were funded more, then I realized, okay, the writing has to be just, has to be so um, precise and concise in so many ways. It's not about what I did the first time around by just throwing things together. Like it's an art, you really have. So I used to hear people talk about grants making or grantsmanship. I think this term is used often, but I don't think I understood it until writing and reading more of the funded grants to just understand, how to write a grant. And it still doesn't mean it will get funded, but at least I think, grantsmanship is very important in at the higher you go, because you are competing with individuals who have been writing grants for 20 years, 30 years or longer. They have developed the skills of writing grants and have strong teams. So you have to do your best to.
And sorry, Donaldson, we actually have a hard stop in a minute. Sorry, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
sorry about that. Let me stop then.
No, but that's great. And the other thing is the thing that I love, like Dr. Conserve it's tenacity. Like some of the themes here are just awesome. Like he had this nugget, like a lot of the things from his first grant, that same idea is the whole centerpiece of the later R01 that's funded, which is awesome. Like the fact that you got into the NIH system, that you were able to get grants over time, the fact that at one point you're like, you know what? I need to be a dad. I need to like stop focusing on grants for a little bit and then come back to it. And you were able to kind of gracefully do this. I mean, that's just I applaud. I applaud Dr. Conserve. It's really fantastic. And I apologize that we don't have more time. I know there's a bunch of Q&A questions, but we do have a hard stop. We've got to run now. For everyone coming back next week, remember it'll be an hour earlier because of our Australian colleague. So just a quick note. Thanks again, Donaldson. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Take good care. Bye bye.
Bye everyone. Bye.